Welcome back to episode 3 of Everything Wet, Dry, Wet. In week 1, we talked about the difference between your dry and wet sections and then told you how to hook up a simple pseudo wet, dry, wet rig to dip your toes into the world of wet, dry, wet. In week 2, we talked about series and parallel signal routing, and then we also mentioned kill dry and how that affects your signal. Gives you that really good amp separation between your wet and your dry amps. And then now in week 3, we're going to talk about some of the common problems of running a wet dry and wet dry wet rig, and that has to start with ground loops and phase issues. So whenever you run more than one amp or line, you have the potential to run into ground loop problems. This is what a ground loop sounds like. Beautiful, right? We want to make sure that we cover our bases when we're running more than one line or more than one amp. This means having audio transformers in your signal path. If you're running 2 amps, you need to have 1 audio transformer to cover your bases. If you're running 3 amps, you need to have 2 audio transformers in your signal path to cover your bases. Basically, you need 1 less audio transformer than the amount of lines you want to run. If you don't have these audio transformers, it basically means going back to 1 amp for that gig. Ground loops are typically venue dependent. So some venues have great grounding and you really won't run into too many issues. Other venues are horrible and you will have ground loop issues almost every time you play. So it really is something you want to prepare for ahead of time. So now that we have ground loops covered, we need to talk about phase issues. This starts when you have more than 1 line or amp running. So let's say we have a Vox AC30 on our dry line, getting a lot of chime in there, and we have a Fender Twin on our wet line. If the Vox's speaker is moving out when the Fender's is coming back in, these amps are now out of phase, and they're going to be canceling frequencies. Here's an audio example of 2 lines that are out of phase, and then we put them back in phase with an audio transformer. As you can hear, 2 lines that are out of phase really affect and cut out the bottom end of the signal. Once corrected, the full signal is allowed to come back through again, uncontested, not canceled out. So when you're running more than 1 line, you need to have a way of correcting phase. If you're running 2 amps or 2 lines, you need to be able to correct 1 of them. If you're running 3 lines, you want to be able to invert phase on 2 out of 3 of those lines. The good news, every audio transformer you have in there for ground lift can also be used to flip the phase. I hope that all this talk about ground loops and phase issues are not putting you off from trying out wet dry or wet dry wet, but we do need to cover one last area when it comes to phasing, and that is parallel wet effects. Honestly, any parallel effect can be in or out of phase with each other. So when you have a delay pedal and a reverb pedal, we assume that they're in phase, but if something isn't quite sounding right, maybe they are out of phase. I'm not going to go as far to say that you need a way to correct every parallel line that you have, but it is something to just have in the back of your mind. If it's not quite sounding correct, potentially they are out of phase with each other. Now that we have ground loops, phasing between amplifiers, and phasing between parallel effects covered, now we can move on to some more audio examples. Let's start with a pseudo wet dry rig and a typical wet dry rig and rip apart some of those differences. I'm curious what differences you hear between the pseudo and the typical wet dry rig. I'd love to hear it down in the comments, but as you can hear, there is definitely a bit more separation. We still have them panned a little bit, so it's a bit easier to hear on your phones and computers. But the main difference here is we are running parallel wet effects for the typical wet dry, and we are running series wet effects with dry passing through on the pseudo wet dry. So there is a little bit going on here that is different. The next question we have to cover is what happens when you want to run an ambient sound and you have a dedicated dry amp running. What are you going to do to get rid of that dry effect? Here's a beautiful ambient sound I whipped up, and the dry amp cannot be muted. This is what it sounds like. Thank you. I know, that sounded really good, didn't it? The only downside is that dry amp is picking up all of that alternate picking, all of that quick picking you use to get that ambient sound. You need to have a way to mute that dry amp quickly and easily. As you can see in these audio examples, all you need to do is hold down that switch and you can mute your dry output like that. This is what it sounds like. So much better. Now that that dry amp can be muted, you can have a thick and rich pad sound for your ambient patches without that dry amp sending through every individual pick loud and clear when you don't want it. So you need to have a way to mute that dry amp quickly and easily. This applies for both a pseudo wet dry, wet rig and the typical wet dry, wet rig. So have a way to mute that dry amp. It's very important. As I'm sure you've noticed in some of these audio examples, we are using a Goodwood Audio Custom Junction. This has a stereo or mono input and 2 stereo loops that you can use to put 2 effects in series, hit a button, and then they're in parallel. It also has a dry output that you can mute by holding the foot switch, which means you can kill that dry amp and keep those ambient patches sounding the way they need to. If this is something you're interested in, see the link below, send us an email, and get in touch. We'll see what we can do about putting one in your hands. Now that we are done week 3, we've covered some of the pros and cons of running a wet rig. Some of the pros from today: amp separation when running those parallel effects and being able to correct the phase. Some of the cons is that you need to be able to correct the phase. If your amps are out of phase or your parallel effects are out of phase, you're gonna have to figure out some workarounds. That is why having audio transformers can fix so many of these problems with the push of a button. That is week 3. Let's get ready for week 4 next week when we go even a little bit deeper into wet dry and wet and finish off the series, everything wet.